You're listening to the Diplomats podcast on Asian geopolitics. As always, I'm your host from New York City, Ankit Panda.
And this is Prashant Paramas. We're in from Washington, D.C.
Good to be back with you, Prashant. How have you been?
Good. How are you doing?
Doing well. Just got back from a long trip to Russia, which was quite illuminating. Of course, we're not going to be talking about that today, but we have a couple topics lined up for today's discussion. Two significant developments. One, I guess, on the positive end of the spectrum and the other on the negative, depending on your perspective. But the first thing we'll talk about is the decision last week by the South Korean government to announce that it would not be renewing the 2016 General Security of Military Information Agreement, or GSOMIA, that it had concluded with Japan. We'll talk a bit about the consequences of that. And then moving on, I guess on the more uplifting side of the ledger, we'll talk a bit about the first ever U.S. ASEAN maritime exercise, which you've written a lot about at The Diplomat. So so that'll be the two topics we'll talk about. But first, why don't we talk a bit about this GSOMIA decision? I mean, did you see that coming?
I think this was something which, as we talked about previously on this podcast, the relationship between Japan and South Korea has been deteriorating. But I do think that for the United States in particular, this is a pretty concerning development. And you've seen that with U.S. officials sort of talk about this as, kind of a very concerning spiral that's developing between Japan and South Korea. Randy Schreiber, the Pentagon's top official for Asia, told CSIS in a discussion with Victor Cha that, the first rule of holes, if you're engaged in them between two countries, is like you stop digging. But it appears that this is something which, both sides are unwilling to sort of give up on this sort of escalation path that they're on.
Yeah, and we talked a little bit about this on the first podcast that we did about the declining relationship between South Korea and Japan. So, listeners, if you missed that podcast, I'd recommend going back and listening to that, because I think it sets a lot of the tone for how we actually got to this point. Because the South Korean withdrawal from this agreement wasn't necessarily out of the blue. And so, we should probably talk a bit about what the agreement actually is, because I think there's some kind of misunderstanding about what exactly GSOMIA was and what it does. So for the first thing to say is that GSOMIAs are a generic type of agreement that South Korea has with more than 30 countries, that the United States has with many more countries. It's often considered sort of a foundational agreement for any kind of burgeoning military partnership. What it does is it allows the two participating countries, in the case of our discussion today, South Korea and Japan, to exchange what's known as classified military information, or CMI, through mutually agreed upon procedures. It does not mandate either side to share information. That was a common sort of misperception in South Korea when the political debates there were happening back in 2015 and 2016 about approving the agreement. The South Korean progressives, who are now in charge in Seoul, were very concerned that this agreement would take away South Korea's sovereignty and effectively require Seoul to share sensitive military information with Tokyo. But it doesn't do that. It simply sets up the basis for the South Koreans to ask the Japanese to share certain bits of sensitive information, such as when a ballistic missile launch from North Korea happens, the South Koreans can check their data against what Japan has and compare notes if they were to choose to do so. Mm-hmm. And so the other component is that in sort of Northeast Asia trilaterally, you're looking at a very different array of sort of sensors available to South Korea, Japan, and the United States, certainly when it comes to tracking things like North Korean ballistic missile launches. For the Obama administration, which was sort of instrumental in promoting the conclusion of the GSOMIA between the two U.S. allies, this was a major sort of justification. It was that, under Kim Jong-un, we're seeing this very quickly improving pace of ballistic missile launch activities, so I think our two allies should really conclude this agreement to better share information and coordinate. So, for instance, the South Koreans rely only on terrestrial sensors to track North Korean missile launches, which is pretty limiting. But, of course, in the context of the U.S.-South Korea alliance, the South Koreans get very rapid access to the U.S. Sensor array, which is land, sea, air, and space-based. So the United States has the best information about let's say the components of a North Korean ballistic missile launch. It can track, the time it happens, the location it happens, and share that with the South Koreans. Japan, by contrast, has a slightly larger sensor array. So in the context of sort of trilateralism, it's always better to have more sensors available to you when you're trying to track something like a missile launch. So GSOMIA was a way to sort of make that process a lot more streamlined. Without the agreement, what used to happen was that, the analogy that I used was the idea of the United States sort of having to run between two rooms to, talk to the South Koreans, get what the South Koreans told them, and then run to the next room and then tell the Japanese what the South Koreans said, as opposed to the South Koreans and the Japanese just being able to talk to each other about these questions. So that's really what we've lost here.
No, absolutely. And I think that's a really critical point to emphasize, right? Because it gets to this point which, for U.S. policy, a longstanding goal has been sort of encouraging more networking between these various alliances and partnerships that they have. And Japan and South Korea are obviously the best test cases for that, because within the Asia Pacific, they're the two sort of broad and most sort of developed and mature alliances there. But with respect to the actual realities, the fact is that the United States and its relationship with Japan and South Korea individually transcends by multiple levels what Japan and South Korea enjoy with each other. And I think that's part of the U.S. concern, which is that, if Japan and South Korea are not doing their own bit for the alliance network, then the United States has to do more of this running around between the two countries. And that, I think the other part of this that's really interesting is, you have the Trump administration that's coming in that's talking about we need to have greater clarity about this sort of China threat. And, we have these, network of alliances and partnerships that we're trying to bring to bear with respect to a rising China. But whenever you have disagreements between these individual allies and partners, that actually makes the picture a lot more complicated for the United States and U.S. policy. So I think that partly also motivates the frustration among U.S. policymakers, which is that, when this stuff happens, the only people that benefit are U.S. competitors, right?
That's right. Yeah, so the other point I think worth emphasizing on GSOMIA is the implications, I think, in particular for the U.S.-South Korea alliance. So a lot of observers I spoke to sort of thought that GSOMIA would perhaps be the red line for Seoul. We'd heard it mooted back in July after the export controls. The South Koreans were talking about, well, maybe we should withdraw from GSOMIA. But at the time, I think a lot of observers sort of took it as an example of brinksmanship, that Seoul really wanted Washington to intervene in the dispute between itself and Japan on the South Korean side. And of course, Washington was unwilling to do that. But when South Korea finally pulled the plug on GSOMIA or said that it won't renew the agreement, I think some people were just caught off guard. And I think especially in D.C., among some people who worked on the GSOMIA trilateral negotiations under the Obama administration, or rather the U.S. role in promoting the bilateral talks between the two sides, were a little bit, shocked by this, because I think it's really a poor message from South Korea saying that, this agreement that was very important to the United States isn't really worth keeping for them, in the context of the alliance. And I think that's going to have a little bit of a blowback. And of course, as you and I know, the Trump administration's broader approach to the U.S.-South Korea alliance has already created a broader range of problems. So I think this only puts the alliance in a more difficult position going forward. But the final thing to be said, I've seen some commentary saying that, South Korea withdrawing from GSOMIA is sort of going to be a huge blow to South Korean national security. I think that's a little bit overdone. Given that this is a foundational agreement, it's not particularly the basis for a South Korea-Japan alliance, certainly something like that. And, as long as South Korea does have access to the U.S. Sensor data, at least with regards to North Korea, I think the level of readiness of the alliance does remain particularly high. Obviously, I think what's lost is that symbolic aspect of trilateralism and networking, as you mentioned, and that does have consequences, I think, for broader security in Northeast Asia. But certainly, I think we're looking to see where this might go next. The South Korean Prime Minister Lee Nak-yon, who's a Japan specialist, actually. He's actually raised the prospect that GSOMIA could be renewed if Japan were to pull back its export controls and trade restrictions on South Korea. So it seems like there's at least some interest in using this as a bargaining chip. And I've been talking to a few folks based in Seoul, and sort of the understanding that I get from those conversations is that there is sort of palace politics going on here. The South Korean left, there are a variety of views about the advisability of withdrawing from GSOMIA. For instance, the National Intelligence Service, NIS, was vocally actually against the withdrawal, saying that it did suit South Korea's national security interests. But there are sort of others in the Blue House, more focused on domestic issues, that saw this as a huge political win, and it's been broadly popular in South Korea, where, as we discussed on the last podcast, anti-Japan sentiment is growing rather rapidly in this unprecedented crisis between the two countries.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I would flag for listeners the interview that you did with Jim Shoaf that came out in our latest issue of the magazine, where, he's somebody who's watched these issues for a long time, and even he is, very concerned, I think, throughout the interview about the prospects for Japan-South Korea relations. And I think the big issue to my mind is, how does this all play out in the future, right? Because the agreement expires officially in November. Later this year. So it'd be interesting to see how both sides navigate the political and security dynamics going forward.
Yeah, and obviously the North Koreans actually gave the region a reminder about why something like GSOMIA was useful. They conducted a ballistic missile launch just days after the South Koreans announced that they'd be withdrawing from the agreement. So yeah, absolutely, a lot can happen between now and November. But I wouldn't hold my breath for this crisis between the two countries to resolve itself anytime soon. So I guess on that note, let's switch gears to the second part of our discussion today, Prashant. And I guess we're just on the eve of the start of the first ever U.S.-ASEAN maritime exercise, which will be taking place in the waters in the South China Sea. So you wrote a bit about why this was significant and sort of where this was coming from. So do you want to tell us a bit about what exactly we can expect from this first maritime exercise between the two sides?
Sure. I think, the details so far, it's been really interesting seeing, what all sides have been saying about this actual engagement. So what we know so far is that, it's going to take place between September 2nd to September 6th. And we know that, in terms of locations, it's going to kick off, from Thailand and go through Vietnam. And it's going to involve, as with many of these exercises, it's sort of the banner is a U.S. ASEAN maritime exercise, but the actual involvement by various Southeast Asian countries will be varied, right? So usually, there'll be some countries that contribute vessels, others will send observers. So this stuff is actually pretty varied in terms of the level of participation. But in terms of the broader geopolitical significance of this, since we're on an Asia geopolitics podcast, from a U.S. perspective, it's significant because it allows the United States to say that this is kind of the first of its kind multilateral U.S.-ASEAN engagement. That matters because China held its first multilateral engagement and exercise with ASEAN last year. And so it allows for the United States to say, well, it is multilateralizing and developing its exercises. It allows ASEAN to sort of say that, hey, we're balancing various powers. In this environment of U.S.-China competition, we've done an exercise with the Chinese. Now we're doing an exercise with the United States. But in terms of the broader actual implications for security, I would put in a word of caution here that there's actually a lot more continuity than change with respect to the U.S.-ASEAN maritime exercise. The United States already has a broad array of exercises that it conducts with individual Southeast Asian states. And I think this represents just one step forward in that process. But the reason why this will get a lot of headlines and a lot of press is because, we're in this environment of U.S.-China competition, right? So where every development that comes, whether it's on the China part or the U.S. part, will be analyzed for what it says about U.S.-China competition in the broader Indo-Pacific region. And you have developments such as China's as has been reported, including for us at the Diplomat, Carl Thayer has done some good work for us on this. China has been trying to obstruct and limit U.S. engagement with Southeast Asian nations on the security side, including on exercises. So this stuff has probably in terms of operationally a little bit less than what the hype actually represents. But in terms of geopolitical conversation, it's extremely important and significant. And I think we'll see a lot of commentary following the exercise.
Yeah, I think I think that's a good note of caution because what we're seeing, I think, by the fact of these exercises taking place is a manifestation of the state of U.S. ASEAN outreach that really began in the final years of the Obama administration, sort of leading up to this point. But as you noted, politically, the problems that have sort of bedeviled ASEAN when it comes to navigating so-called great power competition and even the South China Sea disputes, I think those very much will remain unchanged as a result of these exercises, right? I mean, in fact, the exercises might even be seen as completely orthogonal to the broader political issues that are currently still a problem for ASEAN, including engagement with China on a binding code of conduct for the South China Sea. Those talks are still underway. But broadly, I mean, from after this exercise occurs, obviously, I think this is not going to be the basis for a transformation in ASEAN's broader security role in the region. But what is the significance of this as sort of a stepping stone for the future of U.S. ASEAN cooperation? Does this actually get us to a new place with ASEAN, or are we sort of still looking at a common set of problems to sort of inhibit further cooperation here?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, and I think the broader question that gets to is, what is the role of Southeast Asia and U.S. Southeast Asia cooperation in this idea of the U.S. free and open Indo-Pacific strategy, which the Trump administration has defined. And it really is pretty unclear. I mean, you and I were at the Shangri-La Dialogue when the former acting Defense Secretary Shanahan was unveiling the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy report. And the fact that we have this report coming out from the Defense Department and the Pentagon, but we haven't seen a sort of U.S. government-wide effort to actually implement the strategy, really speaks to a lot of where U.S.-ASEAN relations are. So under the Obama administration, you had a comprehensive effort to engage ASEAN on economics, on diplomacy, on security, across the board, people-to-people ties, so on and so forth. Under the Trump administration, I think from a Southeast Asian perspective and an ASEAN perspective, a lot of the stuff has actually come on the security side rather than on other aspects of relations. And in fact, some of the obstacles and challenges have actually broadened, with the Trump administration's notion of, economic protectionism and addressing trade deficits and so on and so forth. So I think this U.S. ASEAN maritime exercise, on the one hand, it's encouraging in the sense that the United States is paying more attention to Southeast Asia for security trends and with respect to China. And that's actually something which the Obama administration didn't do as much. There wasn't as much clarity on the China threat question. But if you look at the broader issue of U.S. Southeast Asia relations, I think the greater demand in Southeast Asia, when you talk to diplomats and other observers, is there's a lot going on the security side, and that's great. But what are the other aspects of the Indo-Pacific strategy, and what can Southeast Asia and ASEAN play in that? And I think this notion of an exercise doesn't really get to that bigger question that remains and begs among these countries. I mean, the other issue is whenever you have U.S. ASEAN engagements of any kind, it gets to this issue of what is the distinction between Southeast Asia and ASEAN, right? So we talk about a U.S. ASEAN maritime exercise. ASEAN actually just on its own held its first naval exercise back in 2017. So this is something which, ASEAN uses major power engagement as a way to get the grouping to come together on its own terms. And, 10 very diverse countries in Southeast Asia, that's a huge challenge and continues to be a huge challenge. So important not to confuse U.S. ASEAN engagement with U.S. Southeast Asia engagement.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good cautionary note. And the only other thing I'll mention is that I think earlier this summer we talked a bit about the various modes in which China has been testing various ASEAN South China Sea claimants this summer, including the Philippines, Malaysia, Vietnam, certainly, and. As I think listeners can probably tell from this discussion, that just didn't come up because, I mean, that conversation remains very much separate from these U.S. ASEAN maritime exercises. I think ASEAN especially is not in a place where it can be seen as inviting the United States into the neighborhood to sort of deal with China on these issues, especially given its own bilateral concerns with China, or rather not bilateral, but multilateral in the ASEAN-China context. So I think that, again, highlights the limitations of this ASEAN-U.S. path.
No, absolutely. And I'm glad you brought that up because I think, we've discussed this on the podcast previously, but, Vietnam will be holding the ASEAN chairmanship in 2020. And the last time that Vietnam held the chairmanship was when we saw, heightened concern and issues with respect to the South China Sea, with Hillary Clinton under the then Obama administration talking about U.S. interests in the South China Sea, and China reacting, predictably, in a very concerned fashion. So I think for the Vietnamese, it'd be really interesting to see how they navigate the 2020 ASEAN chairmanship, and what does that mean for the United States and for China. That's a really big issue that we're seeing in 2020.
Absolutely. Well, yeah, we'll keep a close eye on all these developments. Well, I think we'll wrap up the conversation there today, Prashant. How does that sound?
Sounds good.
All right. Thanks a lot for joining me.
Good to be with you.
Great. For listeners, before we go, just a note from our sponsor. This episode of the Asia Geopolitics podcast is brought to you by Diplomat Risk Intelligence, or DRI. DRI is the consulting and analysis division of The Diplomat, the Asia Pacific's leading current affairs magazine. Since its launch in 2002, The Diplomat has been dedicated to quality analysis and commentary on events and trends in Asia and around the world, and is now one of the most respected publications covering the region. DRI inherits this approach and offers clients in the private, public, and nonprofit sectors worldwide access to an exclusive network of subject matter experts and analysts. Whatever your needs in the wider Asia-Pacific region, DRI can offer the knowledge and expertise necessary to anticipate and manage geopolitical and geoeconomic risks. For more information, please visit dri.thediplomat.com. So, if you like what you heard on the podcast, also make sure that you subscribe on either iTunes, Google Play, or Spotify, or any other number of services. And if you've been a subscriber for a while, we'd really appreciate it if you could leave us a rating on any of those services as well. That really helps get the word out about the show. So, thanks a lot for listening, and Prashant and I will be back next week with more.